Cyberpunk 2077 is an IP well known for its beautiful world building. The characters, locations, history, and overall atmosphere is simply unrivaled in its sphere. Fortunately for CDPR, and unfortunately for the cyberpunk genre, no other game has really come close. It's difficult to put into words just how beautiful the environment is and how well executed the concept is for a AAA break into gaming. Yes, I say AAA because there was a platformer back in 2007. And I'm saying as an IP, obviously despite its vast change in gameplay, this isn't CDPR's first AAA game. It really shouldn't come as a surprise when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This IP was established back in the late 1980s with the tabletop RPG Cyberpunk 2013. At the end of the day, this form of role-playing is the purest of the genre, so to sprout from the medium with so much time to create a foundation is a recipe for success. And yes, the tabletop RPGs are confirmed as canon to Cyberpunk 2077. I'll put an official statement from the creator, Mike Pondsmith, up on screen, so pause to read if you like. But just because the game's world is well put together and well received in 2023 doesn't mean it always was. Mike Pondsmith and his company, Talzorian Games, have had plenty of time to make both mistakes and ultimately learn from them. Mistakes that even the very creator wishes to forget about. Just what are these forgotten timelines that have been retconned from canon? How did they come to be? What did they change? And just how bad was the community pushback against them? Today, we will be taking a dive into the unfavorable history of the Cyberpunk IP and picking apart the oddities within. Some oddities that even have the capacity to give us a glimpse at the major conspiracies forming in canon. All of this, so you don't have to. Let's begin. 1990 marked the release of Cyberpunk 2020, Talzorian's follow-up to the popular 2013 edition. It followed an obvious 7-year time skip, retcons to accommodate the German reunification in 1990, and was overall meant to streamline and update its predecessor. The types of things you'd expect, such as updated rules for combat, net running, and character generation. This was the exciting part though. Cyberpunk 2020 was a major success and gained the IP a lot of traction. It went on to get a total of 28 supplements, sourcebooks, and adventures between 1993 and 1996. This is just including Talzorian's own publishings. Looking at Atlas Games, 2020 got another 12 adventures. While these weren't canon, I definitely wish some of the insane stories were. But backtracking to Talzorian, early on in their publications came a sourcebook to follow up Cyberpunk 2020 setting, one set in the year of 2027 that is now retconned from the timeline, an alternate world sourcebook by the name Cybergeneration. The first edition would even require the 2020 rulebook, as many others would. Released in 1993, the story centered around teenagers with unusual superhuman skills gained from a nanotech virus, which would be known as the Carbon Plague, an event that was recycled in a Cyberpunk Red, but was contained rather than having the opportunity to spread. This sourcebook definitely became a standout in large part to its tone and themes. Corporations had now become the new world governments. Players took on the role of youngsters, and heroic motives seemed to strangle the previous saying, Cyberpunk isn't about saving humanity, it's about saving yourself. A theme of Cyberpunk that is core to the setting. After all, much of what makes Cyberpunk is the grim reality you find yourself in. One that isn't forgiving to those who try to make some big name for themselves. A world where a would-be legend that oversteps at the wrong moment has their name erased from existence. It's certainly no fantasy land. So the superhero fiction prevalent in the story completely shifts its core. But that's not to say Cybergeneration doesn't still share a lot of its DNA with the canon timeline, which shows in the fact that Mike Pondsmith doesn't regret Cybergeneration in the way he does Cyberpunk v3, which we will be covering later in the video. A lot of this story is recycled in the canon timeline while providing us a unique opportunity to see more of the characters we love be expanded on ahead of Firestorm Stormfront and Shockwave, in a way that simply wouldn't be possible otherwise. Many of the details us fans consider canon about legends like Raish Bartmoss or Morgan Blackhand were established in Cybergeneration, which shouldn't feel so bad to say, seeing as it was never meant to alter the established timeline of 2020. So anything mentioned about a character that predates the year 2020, in theory, should still be canon material. Take for example the legendary solo Morgan Blackhand. It establishes him as a veteran, named his hometown, and shared the story behind his introduction to Militech, all of it leading up to his reputation and trademark appearance. Even the detailing of his transition to tactical operations and strategic threat management rings true in the Firestorm series. It is only once we've reached 2020 that things derail from the story we know. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Should we really be ignoring this now defunct Cyberpunk entry? I would say, well, probably. If you don't want spoilers, that is. Even just drawing from yet again Blackhand's story, there are parallels that can be formed, despite what little we know about him after 2023 in canon. In Cybergeneration, Blackhand had resigned from Militech and began freelancing, eventually being approached by the ISA to run the new Agent Corps, one that would prioritize hunting down children affected by the carbon plague. Blackhand's personal code was pretty clear, so he refused the offer. In response, the ISA sent in a Spec Ops team to assassinate him. Of course, this didn't go as planned and went extremely south, ending with their second in command dead in their offices and a trail of bodies behind a Blackhand who was happy to prove his point. He went on to retire to an offshore fortress, followed by loyal ex-Militech solos. This entire corporate betrayal and retirement heavily mirrors what we currently know in canon. Militech, in some way or another, had detonated the nuke prematurely under Blackhand's feet during the 2023 Arasaka assault. So according to Mike Pondsmith, Blackhand had pretty much taken the opportunity to go off the grid, leaving the corporate lifestyle behind and slimming down due to missing out on fancy corporate paid meals. An interesting comparison is even made to the movie Logan, so things seem to be clicking for the most part. But as we approach the end of Blackhand's character sheet, we are thrusted into the story of Old Cunningham and Johnny Silverhand in the year of 2027, one that seems to parallel a much larger conspiracy in the current canon. But until you start connecting the minor details and tabletop adventures of Red, the story between the two may appear alien at a glance. In this timeline, not much is left to mystery. Old Cunningham had been doomed to life as an AI after Johnny Silverhand unplugged her in his rescue attempt, with Silverhand depositing her now mindless husk safely in a cold sleep. Of course, not changing anything from the previous canon. While we never officially learn of what Silverhand did with her body that held a very faint pulse, we could assume he wouldn't have just given up and disposed of it. Back to Cybergeneration, Alt went on to steal $20 million from the Arasaka mainframe to plan an escape. Using these newly acquired funds, she set up a small, highly secret research corp through her now huge web of investment accounts. Over these 9 years, she directed her employees to study the most advanced techniques in cloning technologies, including stolen data on Biotechnica's failed cloning attempts in 2019, with an eye towards replicating her frozen body, which is all tried and true tech in current canon. By 2019, Alt had reversed the soul killer process with a new program. He instructed her employees to bring a cloned body to the lab and prepared the downloading process. But obviously, this being Cyberpunk and all, it hadn't gone so smoothly. Instead of her AI conscious being transferred, she had actually transferred her basic personality into a clone. She had learned it was only possible to copy her neural net into the waiting brain. The original remained trapped. Hopeless of her return to reality, she let the second Old Cunningham run free, while she went on to create Shangri-La for the hundreds of soul killer victims and other disembodied personalities transferred into the net, also known as the Ghost Town, the very same concept we learn about in Cyberpunk Red in 2077. And here comes Johnny Silverhand, a rocker boy who, rather than fall victim to Atom Smasher during a raid on Arasaka Tower, falls victim to a Biotechnica-sponsored assassination, only to end up being met with an offer by Old Cunningham's clone while trapped in a cryo tank with half his body gone, which, funnily enough, Silverhand seems to always lose half of his body, or guy. This was the offer: to upload his engram to the net via Soulkiller and download him into a suitable body. But there was a secret up Alt's sleeve. This wouldn't be the original Johnny. It was an unaware copy sent out to roam while the original was data stored for safekeeping. That way, if he ever ended up being killed again, Alt 2 would be capable of farming copies of his engram and body to make more and more. Like I said, this all sounds like a fanfiction that has no attachment to 2077, but you'd be wrong. Cyberpunk Red's Black Dog adventure provides a good foundation for this entire story being in canon. In this adventure, a group of edgerunners are tasked with transporting a mysterious crate from Night City to Los Alamos in New Mexico, their employer being a full Borg named Samantha Stevens. The prevalence of this detail lies in a cancelled story, an entire short story that happens at ground zero of the AHQ disaster, and how Samantha ended up with Johnny's body. It was completed and meant to be put in the also cancelled Aftershocks book. However, due to a certain attack in 2001, it was no longer appropriate to release it in the face of so much real-world death. So we instead received this adventure later down the line. While it is never explicitly confirmed it is Johnny's body within the crate, there are some convincing reasons as to why it would be. Beyond the fact it is Samantha Stevens behind the gig, she also has possession of Silverhand's unique Malorian and Porsche. Then there's the client receiving this crate, a woman and close friend of Samantha by the name Angel, who bears a shocking resemblance to Alt Cunningham. She has possession of an unreleased samurai song and is taking refuge in a lab. To tie a ribbon on it all, this quote is straight from the text after the crew leaves. There's a hissing of compressed air, of utter cold that blows back her hair, as the casing splits to reveal the blue-white ice of the hidden cryo chamber. She tenderly looks down at the dark, frozen face behind its masking curtain of ice. "Hello, my love," she says. End quote. After all of this tied-in information between Cybergeneration, the cancelled Aftershock story, and Black Dog, I simply can't imagine Angel being anyone else. This is the version of events I've thought of pertaining to current canon. The events of a Cybergeneration story are obviously shifted to the time of Red rather than the 2020s to better fit the canon of the Fourth Corporate War, in which Angel gets possession of Silverhand's body, produces a clone for him as well, but also keeps his original engram in a database. So while these two are running around, or discovered, Arasaka manages to get their hands on the stored version of Silverhand's engram. All of this explaining why Relic Johnny was still stuck in cyberspace for 50 years, and why the Alt Cunningham we come across in cyberspace isn't similar to the one Johnny once knew. She had lost a portion of herself. So to wrap it all up, yeah, I think a lot of this story applies to current canon. Now that I've laid out the setting, lore, atmosphere, and suspiciously connected character stories, I think it makes sense to talk about the fan reception of this title. Well, I would say it shouldn't come as any surprise to you that it was well received by both critics and fans, so much so that it went on to get its own standalone edition in 1995. Two of the most notable reviews have this to say. The whole thing was written to be seriously non-linear, but a cleaner design might have helped organize things better for players who don't want to memorize the contents of the book, the type of players who will love Cybergeneration. A lot of people talk about systems that encourage roleplay over role-playing. Cybergeneration is one of the few games I've encountered that actually manages to do so, not by using a heavy-handed or pretentious approach, but by the very nature of the game environment. End quote. Even to this day, avid fans of Cyberpunk and Cybergeneration recommend it eagerly to any inquiring new fans. Despite being a shift in tone and atmosphere, arguably being a far more massive leap than it should have been coming from 2020, the game remains beloved by many and it contains a lot of amazing ideas. Amazing ideas that seem to have been recycled to the core Cyberpunk timeline, despite being retconned to an alternate universe. You're probably feeling pretty damn good about now. Cybergeneration was a fairly amazing adaptation that provided me a platform to lore dump you with theories just now. It's spoken about lovingly by its creators and is even still in print and sale on their web store. Well, Art Talzorian went on to create the Firestorm Stormfront and Shockwave sourcebooks, detailing the Fourth Corporate War and ending in 2023, which were both popular and added only good things to the IP, so everyone was excited from the teased follow-up Firestorm Aftershock. But this long-awaited third volume, meant to tie up all the loose ends together and herald the end of the old Cyberpunk 2020 game world, would end up cancelled, later to be folded into the Cyberpunk v3 rulesbook. Keep in mind the one glaring fact as we dive into this edition. It was meant to be a core rulebook to act as the next Cyberpunk 2020 and be canon to the series going forward, so the fact it is now defunct, only had 2 sourcebooks published to accompany it, and is no longer in print despite being a decade younger than Cybergeneration, should paint a clear image in your head. Not to mention that Mike Pondsmith himself refuses to even think about it. V3 found itself in the era following the Fourth Corporate War and events of Firestorm. The data crash has resulted in the widespread corruption of the net and major losses of hard copy data to the point that all data is intangible and recent recorded history is in doubt. An example that pops up in Pondsmith's demos at conventions, releases on the internet, and in the finished game is that knowledge and recorded history has become lost or corrupted. Many people in the world now believe Richard Nixon, instead of resigning over Watergate, committed suicide on camera, and that memes such as the moon landing being a hoax became prevalent. The war has also led to the collapse of nations, the world economy, and many of the staple mega corporations. This civil upheaval leads to the rise of alternative cultures, which is where the setting ultimately falls apart. V3 couldn't decide what it wanted to be, and this was exemplified by splitting society into 6 alt cults, each latching onto a particular ideology. And let me just say, even after understanding what alt cults are, my mind always just jumps straight to Alt Cunningham cults, rather than alternative cults. Maybe I'm just slow, but I hope I'm not the only one. All of this, much like Cybergeneration, is a dramatic change in setting and style. With the introduction of alt cults and confusion behind the data crash, everything molded to become an odd sourcebook. One that, despite introducing some pretty solid or interesting concepts, took them way too far. I mean, seriously, the idea of historical records being lost is cool, but the rate in which people start believing massive conspiracies as fact only a decade following the data crash seriously halts the believability in a setting otherwise known for its gritty realism. Not just this, but the focus on memes is just a little off-putting. Let me just put something up on screen for you. You're probably wondering, why am I showing you an action figure? Is it some sort of merchandise Artalzorian used to sell? Or do I just have a cool little collection that I can't show anywhere else? Well, no to both of these. These photos or customized action figures are the backbone of V3's artwork. Definitely not the image you had in mind of this book while I was discussing its setting, I'm sure. To unfortunately drag it even further, the color scheme and aesthetic, it should have been caught and overhauled long before publishing. I actually think a primary factor in the death of this book was the aesthetic. It was an insane shift from previous editions, while the majority of images also failed to match the implied atmosphere in the text. There's just not much room to start painting an accurate mental setting if you have these pages staring back at you. I don't really wish to beat a dead horse. I genuinely enjoy the work of Mike and Artalzorian, and the mistakes made in V3 only helped to build an enjoyable experience with Cyberpunk Red, one of those many changes being the promotion of artists to visualize the world for us fans. Seriously, it's been decades, and I'm certainly not the first to cover the negatives. So with a general understanding of its setting and aesthetic, just what was the reception on release? Probably what you would expect. It was met with a wave of fans expressing their disappointment. The obvious complaints cite the dramatic change in setting and style, as well as the use of action figures instead of more traditional works of art. Then to further confuse players, despite acting as a follow-up to the Firestorm series, it failed to do the job Aftershock was meant for. It really did seem that this edition was rushed out unnecessarily rather than being postponed in favor of neatly wrapping up the Firestorm series. Mike Pondsmith would even go on to say that V3 had been removed from the canon and that many elements were reworked into Cyberpunk Red. Though in complete honesty, I fail to see many of its story or aesthetic shining through in red. I actually seem to see Cybergeneration, as previously stated, more than anything. There just wasn't much that could be recycled in a fitting way from V3. Even 5 years after its release, I found a pretty lengthy review on RPG.net, which ultimately rated it a 2 in style and a 3 in substance, with the review summarizing to this: I don't want to hate this game, but I'm struggling for nice things to say about it. It's not awful, provided you squint a lot and ignore the setting. Looking through the comments on this post provides a much more telling perspective of community opinion. You are correct, it is a piece of shit. I am so glad I got the PDF cheap because I would have ripped my eyeballs out if I had paid for that thing full price in print. Thanks for confirming that I have the last good version of Cyberpunk. In some ways, it's nice if a new version sucks so bad that you won't have anyone arguing with you about sticking with an older version. Even hopping over to more recent Reddit threads, you find the same stigma. It committed the cardinal sin of all media. It wasn't just garbage. People love to talk about garbage. They'll hate on garbage all day long, with some people qualifying as Olympic grade fetchers. No, 3.0 isn't just garbage, it's forgettable garbage. When it came out, the community as a whole just went, well, this sucks, and promptly ignored it. And since it was a niche market to begin with, there wasn't the massive wave of contention that a bad D&D edition might bring. We just kept using our 2020 stuff and let 3.0 die, and without a major corporation backing it, die it did. I hold 2 source books before it got buried. Even after reading these, the best thing about this community was that it didn't experience the same community hatred some series might. I was genuinely afraid Cyberpunk/Artalzorian was going to perish after Cyberpunk v3. I was so incredibly stoked when 2077 was announced because I knew it would reinvigorate interest in my favorite TTRPG/setting, end quote. And reinvigorate it did, choom. There are more fans than ever, and despite 2077's broken release or quote-unquote flaws, it remains the best in the genre to many of us. Even as a fan of the Deus Ex series, it just can't come close to the awe I experience exploring Night City and the legends within. Even after this entire video, I would still encourage you to pick up the source books and experience it all for yourself. Though V3 is a tad bit difficult to find physically and can be a strain on the eyes, it's educational. But me taking this exploration wouldn't have been possible without you all. That's why, in the word of God, as Pondsmith likes to quote his statements, you're a legend. In fact, you're all legends. And that, chooms, is everything I have to share about the retcon timelines of Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk. I originally meant to include a section about the hardwired sourcebook, but chose not to. As far as I can tell, it is quite literally not connected in any way to the main timeline, or even Cyberpunk itself. It was just a way to play in the universe of the novel Hardwired by Walter John Williams, through the use of Cyberpunk 2013's rulebook. So for that obscure connection, that really isn't a connection, it wasn't included. Which I'm sure you all can understand. I think. I hope you learned something new, and that I've shed some light on the history, conspiracies, and characters of this dystopia. Let me know down below your favorite part of the video, and what other thoughts or even experiences you have with these source books. I'm sure as usual there's plenty of viewers that were around during these releases. I'd love to hear everything you have to say. If you're new and enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel for all your Cyberpunk needs. If you'd like to take the extra step to support my channel, all of the appropriate links will be down below. A big thanks to all the channel members up on screen. I appreciate all of you chooms for the support, as it motivates me to make bigger and better videos. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to create content I love, and it means a lot to me. So, as always, make sure to have a great week, and I will see you later, chooms.